Thank you. A lawsuit brought forth by two counselors is challenging the state's rules on conversion therapy based off free speech and religion.
They're asking a federal judge to block enforcement of the rule on talk therapy here in Wisconsin with help from conservative law firm Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Governor Tony Evers and the state licensing board are listed as defendants. Drew Best shares more about the lawsuit with arguments from both sides.
The First and 14th Amendments are once again facing a challenge, this time from two Christian counselors here in Wisconsin. With the help of conservative law firm Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, or WIL, they are challenging a state administrative rule that labels methods intended to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity, with certain exceptions, as unprofessional conduct.
WIL argues the rule prevents counselors from giving verbal advice consistent with their faith. One of the counselors involved in the litigation saying in part, quote, "Government officials should not be allowed to police the private conversations I have with my clients who voluntarily seek out my advice as a Christian counselor. They have no right to punish me for saying something they disagree with," end quote. The lawsuit cites a recent Supreme Court ruling on a case titled Childs v. Salazar, in which a federal court decided a similar rule in the state of Colorado violated the First Amendment rights of licensed counselors. But those who support the state's rule, like Fair Wisconsin, feels that Supreme Court decision did not consider the potential repercussions it could have on patients.
That decision was not about whether it is safe or whether it is advisable. And that is, frankly, very important to know because it is neither. Conversion therapy is not safe and it is actively harmful for entire families.
This lawsuit also follows a letter from Governor Tony Evers to WIL, saying he has no intention of repealing the ban, arguing the practice is at best ineffective and at worst dangerous. Abigail Sweat says no amount of talk therapy can change someone's gender identity or sexual orientation.
That is something that we are as humans, and when you set up a youth to be in a situation where someone with a license or a leader is telling them they need to change who they are, that is what creates the distrust. And it also just creates a lot of shame.
The defendants in this case must respond to the litigation within 21 days of its initial filing. In the newsroom, Drew Best, Action 2 News.